Charles Raymond Starkweather was born into a world that never intended to notice him. He grew up in Lincoln, Nebraska, in a working-class family where survival mattered more than emotion. From early childhood, Starkweather was small, physically weak, and socially isolated. He was bullied relentlessly, mocked for his speech impediment, his posture, and his inability to defend himself. Every insult reinforced a single idea that would slowly consume him. Power belonged to those who could take it. School offered no escape. Starkweather did not blend in. He did not adapt. He watched from the margins as others established dominance through strength and confidence. What he lacked physically, he began to replace with fantasy. He became obsessed with violence, idolizing figures who commanded fear. Movies, crime stories, and outlaw myths shape his understanding of respect. To Starkweather, admiration and terror were indistinguishable. As a teenager, his behavior hardened. He developed a volatile temper and an exaggerated sense of grievance. Minor slights became personal attacks. Authority figures were enemies. He rejected discipline not as rebellion, but as refusal to accept inferiority. His worldview narrowed until it contained only two roles: those who dominated and those who were dominated. Starkweather was determined never to be the latter again. By the mid-1950s, his fixation on violence intensified. He spoke openly about hatred, revenge, and power. He admired criminals not for money or freedom, but for the fear they inspired. This was not posturing. It was identity formation. Violence was becoming central to who he believed he was meant to be. At the same time, Starkweather's emotional development remained stunted. He lacked empathy, patience, and restraint. Relationships were transactional and shallow. When he met Carolyn Fugate, a young girl still in her early teens, he saw not a partner, but an audience. Someone who looked at him with fascination rather than contempt. Their relationship would later become one of the most controversial aspects of the case, but its foundation was simple: control. Starkweather drifted through low-paying jobs, unable to sustain normal life. Responsibility felt like submission. He carried resentment toward employers, strangers, and anyone who appeared more successful. Each perceived humiliation added weight to a growing internal pressure. The desire to be seen, to be feared, became obsessive. Weapons entered his life not as tools, but as symbols. A firearm represented the power he had been denied since childhood. With it, he believed the hierarchy would reverse. The world that had ignored him would finally be forced to acknowledge him. By 1957, Starkweather's mindset had fully separated from societal norms. Violence was no longer hypothetical. It was inevitable. He believed the world owed him recognition, and he was prepared to collect it by force. What he lacked in planning sophistication, he compensated for with impulsive brutality and absolute disregard for life. The first killing did not come with hesitation. It came with release. Once the boundary was crossed, there was no retreat. Each act of violence reinforced his self-image as powerful and unstoppable. Fear replaced invisibility. Blood replaced insignificance. What followed was not a single crime, but a spree, a rapid escalation of killings across Nebraska and Wyoming that would leave entire families dead and shock the nation. Starkweather was no longer a bullied boy. He was becoming something far worse. That the first killing did not erupt from chaos. It emerged from frustration that had fermented for years. By late 1957, Charles Starkweather had already detached himself from the moral boundaries that restrained others. He no longer measured actions by consequence, only by impact. The desire to be feared outweighed every other consideration. Violence was no longer an idea, it was a solution waiting to be used. Starkweather's life at that point was defined by instability. He moved between low-paying jobs, failing to meet expectations and resenting anyone who enforced rules. Authority felt like humiliation. Each reprimand confirmed his belief that the world existed to suppress him. When he was fired from a service station in Lincoln, Nebraska, the resentment crystallized into action. The dismissal was not merely a loss of income. In his mind, it was an attack on his identity. Armed and volatile, Starkweather returned to the station. The environment was familiar, confined, and symbolically charged. The killing that followed was direct and unhesitating. It marked the moment when thought became action and fantasy became reality. The act was not impulsive in the emotional sense, it was impulsive in execution. Once the trigger was pulled, the psychological barrier collapsed completely. This first murder altered Starkweather's internal landscape. Fear of punishment did not surface. Guilt did not restrain him. Instead, the killing produced a sense of empowerment. The world that had diminished him could now be forced into submission. Violence worked. That realization was decisive. From that moment forward, escalation was inevitable. Starkweather did not retreat or attempt to hide the act as a singular mistake. He moved forward, carrying the certainty that he had crossed into a new role. The boy who had been ignored was gone. In his place stood someone capable of shaping reality through force. Carol and Fugate remained with him as events accelerated. Her presence added complexity but did not slow the violence. Whether through coercion, fear, or psychological dependence, she followed him as he moved from one location to another. Their mobility allowed Starkweather to avoid immediate capture and widen the scope of destruction. The killings were no longer isolated. They were becoming a pattern. The next victims were chosen not for who they were, but for where they stood. Opportunity dictated action. Houses became targets. Familiarity did not offer protection. Entire families were wiped out in environments that should have represented safety. Starkweather entered homes, took control, and eliminated resistance without hesitation. The brutality was efficient and absolute. These were not confrontations. They were executions. Victims were given no meaningful chance to escape. Starkweather's behavior revealed a chilling lack of empathy. He did not view those he killed as individuals with lives, histories, or families. They were obstacles, symbols, or instruments in the construction of his self-image. As the body count increased, so did his confidence. Each killing reinforced the previous one. The absence of immediate consequences strengthened his belief that he was untouchable. Law enforcement was always behind, reacting rather than anticipating. The geographic spread of the crimes added confusion, delaying coordinated response. The spree crossed state lines, moving from Nebraska into Wyoming. This expansion elevated the threat from local crime to regional emergency. Yet even then, the full scale of the danger was not immediately understood. Starkweather did not fit existing criminal profiles. He was young, erratic, and motivated by personal grievance rather than profit or ideology. This made him unpredictable. Media coverage intensified as bodies were discovered. Headlines began to connect events that initially appeared unrelated. The narrative shifted from isolated murders to an ongoing rampage. Fear spread through rural communities, where residents were unaccustomed to such violence. Locks were checked repeatedly. Strangers were viewed with suspicion. The sense of safety collapsed quickly. Inside Starkweather's mind, the spree confirmed his worst beliefs about the world. Violence, he concluded, was the only language that commanded attention. Each successful evasion of capture validated his contempt for authority. He did not perceive himself as hunted, he perceived himself as advancing. The psychological transformation was complete. The killings no longer required justification. They existed as proof of dominance. Starkweather's actions demonstrated a dangerous feedback loop. Resentment produced violence. Violence produced empowerment. Empowerment demanded further violence. The trail of destruction left behind was indiscriminate. Children, adults, entire households vanished in silence. Communities were left grappling with the sudden absence of neighbors whose lives had ended without warning. The randomness of victim selection amplified the terror. Anyone could be next. As the spree continued, the inevitability of capture increased. Resources mobilized. Patrols intensified. Roadblocks appeared. Starkweather's mobility became a liability. The violence had drawn too much attention. The world he wanted to dominate was now converging on him. Yet even as pressure mounted, Starkweather did not slow down. The killings continued until the final confrontation approached. By the time law enforcement closed in, the damage was already profound. The spree had achieved its purpose in his mind. He had been seen. He had been feared. The first killing had been the threshold. Everything that followed flowed from that moment. There was no turning back. The point of no return had been crossed, and Starkweather had no intention of stopping until the world forced him to. By the time Charles Starkweather crossed into Wyoming, the violence had reached a scale that could no longer be dismissed as isolated crime. What began as a single killing had expanded into a mobile campaign of death, moving across rural roads and quiet towns with relentless momentum. Each new location became another stage for the same outcome. The pattern was unmistakable. Control, elimination, departure. The spree was no longer accelerating. It was sustaining itself. The geography of the region worked in Starkweather's favor. Long stretches of highway, sparse populations, and limited communication between jurisdictions slowed coordinated response. Law enforcement agencies were reacting to fragments of information, often arriving after the fact. The delay created space for continued violence. Houses that should have been sanctuaries became traps. Familiar roads became corridors of fear. Starkweather's confidence hardened into arrogance. He believed he had exposed the weakness of authority, that the systems designed to stop men like him were slow, fragmented, and ineffective. Each successful movement without capture reinforced his sense of superiority. The killings were no longer reactive. They were preemptive. Any potential obstacle was removed before it could become a threat. Victims were selected by proximity and opportunity. Starkweather did not seek confrontation, he imposed it. Entire families were eliminated in moments, leaving behind scenes of devastation that spoke to method rather than impulse. The absence of hesitation was striking. There was no bargaining, no delay, no retreat. The killings unfolded with brutal efficiency, as if repetition had refined the process. As news spread, the public response shifted from shock to fear. Rural communities, accustomed to isolation and routine, locked their doors and watched passing vehicles with suspicion. The idea that a young man could move freely, killing at will, shattered assumptions about safety. The violence was not confined to cities or criminal districts. It had entered the domestic sphere. Law enforcement escalated its efforts. Roadblocks were established. Descriptions circulated. Patrols expanded beyond local jurisdictions. The manhunt became regional, then national. Starkweather's name appeared in headlines alongside the growing list of victims. The narrative transformed from crime report to warning. He was no longer a suspect. He was a threat in motion. Yet even as the net tightened, Starkweather continued. The pressure did not deter him, it intensified his behavior. Each mile traveled became an assertion of defiance. The spree was no longer about grievance alone. It was about sustaining the image he had constructed, an image of dominance through fear. The presence of Carol and Fugate added a disturbing dimension to the spree. Whether coerced, manipulated, or complicit, she remained part of the movement from scene to scene. Her youth and vulnerability contrasted sharply with the brutality surrounding her. Investigators would later struggle to disentangle her role, but during the spree, her presence did nothing to slow the violence. It moved with them. As the killings accumulated, the psychological distance between Starkweather and his victims widened. The act of killing lost any remaining emotional friction. Death became procedural. The absence of remorse was not hidden, it was structural. Violence had become normalized within his internal logic. There was no endpoint envisioned beyond continuation. The trail of destruction left behind revealed a consistent methodology. Entry without hesitation. Immediate control. Rapid execution. Departure before response. The repetition stripped the crimes of individuality, turning them into a sequence of acts unified by intent rather than circumstance. This uniformity intensified the horror. The randomness was not chaotic, it was systematic. Communities responded with improvised defenses. Neighbors organized watches. Schools altered routines. Churches closed early. The landscape of daily life shifted under the weight of uncertainty. Fear became ambient, present in every unfamiliar sound and passing vehicle. The idea of a lone killer moving freely through the countryside reshaped behavior in real time. As Starkweather moved deeper into Wyoming, the probability of capture increased. Terrain changed. Visibility increased. The isolation that once provided cover began to narrow options. Law enforcement coordination improved as information consolidated. The spree had created its own inevitability. The very attention Starkweather sought was now closing in. The final phase of the spree approached not with dramatic escalation, but with constriction. Routes narrowed. Choices diminished. The momentum that had sustained the violence began to work against him. The world he sought to dominate was now converging, unified by the need to stop him. Despite this, Starkweather did not alter course. There was no attempt to disappear, no strategic withdrawal. The spree had reached its internal conclusion. He had proven what he wanted to prove. The remaining variable was not outcome, but timing. By the time law enforcement closed in, the damage was already irreversible. The killings had achieved permanence. Families were gone. Communities were altered. Fear had been seeded across multiple states. The spree had fulfilled its function within Starkweather's distorted worldview. What remained was confrontation. Not a symbolic reckoning, but a physical end to movement. The hunt that followed was not about preventing further deaths. They had already occurred. It was about containment. The next chapter would mark the collapse of momentum, the end of mobility, the transition from spree to capture. The violence would stop not because Starkweather chose to stop, but because the world he challenged finally closed its grip. The end of Charles Starkweather's spree did not arrive with chaos. It arrived with exhaustion. After days of continuous movement, killings, and evasion, the momentum that had carried him across Nebraska and Wyoming finally collapsed under its own weight. Law enforcement had adapted. Roads were watched. Descriptions were widespread. The space to move freely no longer existed. Starkweather's capture was not heroic, nor dramatic in the way he had imagined his legacy. It was abrupt and final. The man who had moved unchecked through quiet homes and rural highways was reduced to a suspect surrounded by authority. The violence ended not because he chose restraint, but because opportunity disappeared. Once in custody, the magnitude of his crimes became undeniable. Investigators reconstructed the full scope of the spree, connecting scenes that had initially appeared isolated. The total number of victims solidified. Entire families erased. Homes turned into crime scenes. Communities left with silence where life had been. The arrest brought temporary relief, but not closure. The public demanded answers. How could someone so young commit such sustained brutality? How had he moved so freely? Why had there been no earlier intervention? The case exposed the limitations of mid-century law enforcement, particularly across rural and multi-state jurisdictions. Communication gaps, delayed responses, and outdated assumptions had allowed the spree to continue longer than it should have. Starkweather showed no visible remorse. His demeanor reinforced the image of a man detached from consequence. Psychological evaluations described narcissism, hostility, and emotional detachment, but he was found legally competent to stand trial. Unlike other cases where insanity complicated accountability, Starkweather was deemed responsible for his actions. The system would respond with finality. The trial became a national spectacle. Media coverage was relentless, turning Starkweather into a symbol of uncontrolled violence. Newspapers dissected his background, his relationship with Carroll and Fugate, and the progression of the killings. Public fascination mixed with revulsion. He was not portrayed as misunderstood or tragic. He was presented as a predator who had crossed every moral boundary. The role of Carroll and Fugate became one of the most controversial aspects of the case. Her youth and proximity to the killings raised difficult questions about coercion, complicity, and survival. Courts ultimately concluded that she had participated in the spree, a decision that would remain debated for decades. The case forced society to confront uncomfortable truths about influence, power, and vulnerability. Starkweather was convicted and sentenced to death. The verdict reflected not only the severity of his crimes, but the public's need for decisive closure. There would be no institutional confinement, no ambiguity, no prolonged uncertainty. The state chose execution as a statement. This level of violence would be met with irreversible consequence. His execution marked the physical end of Charles Starkweather, but not the end of his impact. The spree entered criminal history as one of the earliest examples of a modern killing rampage. Unlike organized crime or serial killing stretched over years, Starkweather demonstrated how rapidly devastation could unfold when violence was mobile, personal, and unchecked. In the years that followed, criminologists would analyze his case extensively. Patterns emerged. Early social isolation, fixation on power, resentment toward authority, and the normalization of violence through fantasy. These elements would later appear in other cases, across decades and countries. Starkweather was not an anomaly. He was an early signal. Communities affected by the spree never fully recovered. Memorials were informal. Grief was private. The randomness of the killings made collective healing difficult. There was no single location to mourn, no unified narrative to contain the loss. The damage was scattered, just like the violence itself. The most unsettling legacy of Starkweather's crimes lies in their ordinariness. The victims were not public figures or symbolic targets. They were families and homes, people going about daily life. The spree demonstrated that extreme violence did not require ideology, organization, or mass coordination. It required only one individual willing to act and a system unprepared to stop him. Charles Starkweather sought recognition through fear. In that, he succeeded. But the recognition he achieved was not admiration. It was permanent condemnation. His name remains associated not with rebellion or defiance, but with senseless destruction. The story of Starkweather is not a warning about monsters hiding in shadows. It is a warning about how resentment, obsession, and untreated aggression can evolve into catastrophe when left unchecked. His crimes did not emerge from nowhere. They were built, piece by piece, over years of alienation and fixation.